Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started now. Thank you all for coming out this evening. This is a fantastic turnout at the library. My name is Matt Bose. I'm the reference librarian and assistant director here at the library. I'm going to be very brief. I'm just going to talk about a couple of the things going on at the library. We have a couple of bookmarks on the back table there with some of our other upcoming events. We have one about New Hampshire World War II soldiers coming out at the end of October. It's an author who did a lot of research and wrote a book about a cemetery in France where a number of New Hampshire soldiers are buried. And she tells the story of their lives. So that should be really a fascinating talk on Thursday, October 24th at 6:30 in the same room. We also have computer classes going on now through the fall and winter, and there's a complete list of those over there on the table. Next week we have an informative talk about the new healthcare law. AARP will be here to talk about the new law, so if you have any questions and you want to learn more about that, please join us. That's on Tuesday evening, the 15th, and there are handouts about that on the table as well. And tonight's event is actually sponsored by the Friends of the Hooksett Library, and I'm going to turn it over to our director, Heather Shumway, who's going to talk a little bit about the Friends group really quickly.
This is the sales pitch part of your evening. Thank you, truly, as Matt said, thank you all for coming. This is very exciting for us to have so many of you here. Jeremy's talk tonight is a special event for us as it is outside of our budget abilities. And it is brought to you by our Friends of the Library. So part of this is we are starting a membership drive for our friends. I lost my thought. My brain was headed two ways there. The Friends do sponsor various events throughout the year. The membership is very inexpensive. It starts as an individual is $15, family is $25, and you can donate from there. Coming up in November, I have two quick events that I want to tell you about. The first is November 16th is our book sale, and that's the Friends of the Library taking over our book sale this year. And picture this room and that side of the room full of books. I'm telling you, I don't think we've ever had this many. And that all supports our friends. The other event I would like to invite you all to is November 9th at 1 o'clock. We will be celebrating that the Hooksett Library is the New Hampshire Library of the Year. Invite you all to join us. It will be from 1 to 3, and I'm pretty sure our ceremony is about 1:45. We're working on the details of that with dignitaries. We're also looking for our patrons and those that love us best to come and maybe speak a couple words about why we're special to you and all the things that we do. So, hand it over to Jeremy, sign up tonight. Happy to take your money tonight. I'd be happy to send you home with a flyer and come visit us again. Also, please check out our ongoing book sale as you leave, and now you can enjoy your program. Thank you.
So before Jeremy gets started, I'll just tell you a little bit about him. We're very lucky to have him here at the library tonight. He's been called a leading expert on New England's historic lighthouses. He's the author of more than 10 books, which he has brought here tonight on this table here. So I'm sure he'd be happy to sell and sign those for you after the program. He is a past president and historian for the American Lighthouse Foundation and founder and operations manager of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. I believe some of his colleagues are in the audience tonight.
Yes, they are. 3 members of the board right there.
He has a wonderful website that he's put together about New England lighthouse history. It's newenglandlighthouses.net, so you might want to visit that later on. He's taken part in many lighthouse investigations by paranormal research groups, and he calls himself an open-minded skeptic, and he'll share some of his personal experiences here today. So enjoy the evening, and thank you so much, Jeremy, for coming to the library.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. Great to see such an excellent turnout tonight. So my voice is coming through the speaker, right? You're hearing me? Okay, all right. It's a little hard to tell from here. But anyway, I just want to preface my stories of haunted lighthouses of New England by saying a little bit at the beginning here in general about lighthouses. And I wonder if we get, is it possible to get the lights a little lower? Or I don't want to, unless it destroys your video, I don't want.
No, it's perfect.
Okay, all right. We need a little mood lighting for those stories. Excellent, that's perfect. They don't need to see me, they just need to see the picture as well. So I just want to say, starting out, that it's a pretty obvious statement, but people love lighthouses. I probably don't need to tell you that. That's probably why a lot of you are here. But there seems to be something about lighthouses. Wherever you go, people are attracted to them. There's kind of a nostalgia about them. People love to visit them and photograph them. Obviously, they're often beautiful. They're often in beautiful surroundings. And there's just so many aspects of lighthouses that appeal to people. One of the things for me is just the human history of lighthouses, the stories of lighthouse keepers and their families and how devoted they were to these lights in all kinds of conditions and so forth, and the stories of storms and rescues and so forth. Their navigational importance, the technology of lighthouses, the history of lighthouse lenses. There are just so many aspects that appeal to people. And I would say lighthouses are certainly one of the most positive symbols in our culture. They're a very pervasive, positive symbol and icon. It's no accident that they're used by churches and schools and all kinds of businesses as a symbol of hope and strength and faith and steadfastness and trust and just on, just all kinds of very positive qualities. And that's appropriate because lighthouses were built for no other but good reasons, but positive reasons to save life and property. So they're a very positive symbol. With all that said, there also seems to be what I like to call a dark side to lighthouses. Slight pun intended there. And there's something about an offshore lighthouse off by itself on a small island or a rock offshore, in the darkness with the light flashing in the distance or whatever. There's something about that sparks our imagination. I think a lot of us imagine what it was like to live at a lighthouse like that. And no matter what you believe about ghost stories, whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's no doubt that living at some of these isolated lighthouses was a scary existence, a scary way of life, for a lot of different reasons. As Matt said, I call myself an open-minded skeptic. Some of the stories I'm going to tell you tonight would fall into the category of legend, and I'll tell you, what I know about the origin of some of these stories. There's no doubt that some of these stories are based in, imagination and embellishment and so forth that have been embellished over the years. But some of them are also, some of the stories I'll tell you are based on my own personal experiences and the experiences of people who've told them to me firsthand. So I think it's a healthy thing to be an open-minded skeptic. I think, I don't believe that every weird thing I see or hear when I'm at a lighthouse is a ghost. But I think there's, it's a big universe, and I don't think we necessarily understand everything there is to understand in this universe. So I have a very open mind on this subject, and I've certainly had some interesting personal experiences that I'll be telling you about. So let me jump into my stories I'm automatically doing my remote control, but I forgot I'm standing right by the computer, so I don't need to do that. I'm going to start at what I think is a logical place to start, America's first lighthouse, Boston Light, Boston Harbor. Boston, of course, in the early colonial days was a leading port of North America. And because of that, the merchants and mariners of Boston petitioned the colonial government to build a lighthouse there. And they built a lighthouse in 1716 on an island called Little Brewster Island at the entrance to Boston Harbor. This is a drawing of the original 1716 lighthouse, which, by the way, I don't want to it's so hard to not to go off on tangents and tell you all kinds of history about these places, but I just want to mention that the lighthouse that's there today is not the original lighthouse, because the original lighthouse was destroyed by the British when they were evacuating Boston Harbor in 1776. One of their last acts was to set a time charge, and they destroyed that first lighthouse. So the lighthouse that's there today on Little Brewster Island is the 1783, the second tower built there. Anyway, so the light was established in September 1716. And the first lighthouse keeper on the North American continent was a local man from Boston by the name of George Worthylake. And George Worthylake moved to Little Brewster Island in September 1716 with his wife and 2 daughters. And poor George Worthylake had a really kind of miserable, short, tragic career as a lighthouse keeper. I wish I could tell you happy stories, but that's not why we're here tonight. So anyway, he first of all, the colonial government didn't pay him much. And they felt they were doing him a favor, giving him a place to live, and letting him fish around the area and farm on the island if he was able to find any farmable soil. But anyway, he had to do extra things to make a living, to make ends meet for his family. So he doubled as a harbor pilot for incoming vessels. And I just realized when your cell phone went off, it reminded me that my cell phone is still on, and I should probably turn it off. I'm actually going to turn my cell phone off, and I can't yell at anybody else if their cell phone goes off. If mine goes off, so I just turned it off. But anyway, so George Worthylake did extra things to make money for his family. For one thing, he doubled as a harbor pilot. When vessels were coming into Boston Harbor, he would go out and help guide them into the harbor. Another thing he tried to do to make extra money was he had a flock of sheep for a while. and that didn't work out so well. One day, his flock of 59 sheep wandered out on a sand spit off of Little Brewster Island at low tide, and I probably don't need to finish that, that thought. You can guess what happened when the tide came in. That was the end of his flock of 59 sheep. They all were swept away with the tide. So, he, as I said, he just had miserable luck. In November 1718, George Worthylake went into Boston to collect his pay. He went with his wife and one of their 2 daughters. And he picked up his pay in Boston, and they were coming back to Little Brewster Island with, they picked up a family friend on one of the other islands, and they were traveling in a sloop, probably similar to the vessel in this picture here. And they got back to Little Brewster, and they anchored offshore. And I haven't mentioned yet, but there was an African slave living on the island as well. And the slave, excuse me, excuse me. The slave paddled a canoe out to meet the landing party, and so 5 people were crowded into this canoe. Nobody really knows for sure why this happened. There was not a storm happening, not especially rough seas or anything like that, but for whatever reason, the canoe capsized, and all 5 people drowned. Worthylake, his wife, his daughter, the family friend, and the slave. This was huge front page news of its day. This is the triple gravestone of George Ann and Ruth Worthylake in the Cox Hill Burying Ground in the north end of Boston. I don't know if some of you have maybe walked around that cemetery. It's one of those kind of spooky looking old gravestones with the death's heads they used to use, very kind of stark imagery there. And that's again George and his wife, and the middle part would be for their daughter Ruth, who drowned along with her parents. And again, big news of its day. Benjamin Franklin was 12 years old at the time, lived in Boston, and he wrote a poem about this called The Lighthouse Tragedy. He sold copies on the streets of Boston. Franklin later mentioned the poem in his autobiography and called it wretched stuff, but no copy survived, so we're not sure how wretched it was. But anyway, also Cotton Mather, the famous minister in Boston at the time, preached a sermon about this. So just real big news of its day, and still one of the worst lighthouse tragedies in American history. I want to tell you something that, I'm going to jump ahead to the early 1950s to tell you that there was a woman who was the wife of a Coast Guard lightkeeper at Boston Light, and she was living there in the early 1950s. The woman's name was Maisie Anderson. She was the daughter of a Maine lighthouse keeper. And some years later, like in the 60s, she wrote an article for Yankee Magazine about her life at lighthouses. And she said in the early 50s, when they were at Boston Light, on numerous occasions, she sometimes at night would hear what sounded like the sobbing of a little girl outside. And she said that was very strange because there was no little girl on the island, and she would go out and check, and there was nobody there, and she was absolutely sure that's what she was hearing. It sounded like a little girl crying. And she said on more than one occasion, not only did she hear this crying, but the little girl's voice was repeating the word or name Shadwell, Shadwell. Maisie had no idea what that meant. Later, she was researching the history of Boston Light, and she discovered that the slave who died along with the Worthylakes was named Shadwell. So her assumption was that she had actually heard the voice of the daughter of George Worthylake at the time she was drowning, crying out and crying for the slave Shadwell to help her. So she was absolutely sure that's what she had heard. Jumping ahead to the late I keep using the remote because I'm so used to using that in my presentations. Jumping ahead to the late 1980s, this guy, Dennis Dever, was the Coast Guard lightkeeper at Boston Light. Let me make something clear. The Coast Guard took over management of our lighthouses in this country in 1939. Before that, lighthouse keepers were civilian employees of the federal government, and they called it the Lighthouse Service for many years, so I just want to make that distinction. In the late 1980s, Boston Light was due to be the last lighthouse in the United States to be automated. The government was going to automate it and remove the Coast Guard keepers. People were afraid that if the buildings were abandoned, that they would fall to ruin, so as it turned out, they passed legislation to keep a keeper there, and I'll get more into that in a minute. But for a while, it looked like Dennis Dever was going to be the last lightkeeper in the United States, and he loved that role. He loved being a lighthouse keeper. And I'm going to play you a little clip of an interview I did with Dennis Dever at the top of the lighthouse, circa 1989. It's just a brief clip. Let me turn up the sound here so you can hear it. And here we go.
It's a nice environment in the evening when the wind's howling, the snow's flying, and the sea's roaring against the rocks outside your window. Just to sit there in the living room, maybe read Edgar Allan Poe book or something like that. That's what I enjoy doing.
Yeah, he's not kidding. He loved being a lighthouse keeper. He loved storms. He loved ghost stories. And there's something I usually mention at the beginning that I forgot to mention that reminded me. I'll just mention, I was talking about the dark side of lighthouses, and that's something that appealed to a lot of writers over the years. And he mentioned Edgar Allan Poe there. Edgar Allan Poe was writing a story about an isolated lighthouse keeper off the coast of England when Poe died. They found fragmentary notes in his notebook about this lighthouse keeper. And it was obviously he was cooking up something very creepy that was going to happen to this keeper, but we'll never know what it was because he never finished the story. That's what he was working on when he died. So that's just a little side note there. But anyway, Dennis Dever told me about a number of odd things that happened while he was stationed at Boston Light. He's not the only person there who's told me about odd things, but he told me a few interesting stories. For one thing, he said that sometimes he would be working in this boathouse here, and he would have the radio on. He'd be working on a boat or doing some other kind of project in the boathouse, and he would have the radio on, and he'd have it on a rock station. And he said mysteriously it happened a number of times, the radio while he was working would change itself to a classical station. And he would change it back to the rock station. He had a running battle with the radio. But a number of other odd things happened. He said, tools would disappear and just generally odd things. They would always blame it on Old George, meaning the first keeper. And another thing I usually mention a little earlier is that the second keeper who went out to replace Worthy Lake also drowned after 2 weeks on the island. I forgot to mention that. And that's it. People started to think the island was cursed. But as far as I know, no keepers have drowned since then. But anyway, back to Dennis Dever. He told me that one day he was in the keeper's house, which is back here, and he was looking out the kitchen window. He was doing the dishes, I think, at the kitchen sink, and the window over the sink looks out at the lighthouse. And he was looking up at the top of the lighthouse, which has a beautiful, large 19th century lens, a Fresnel lens. Some of you may know what those are, a second order Fresnel lens, about 8 feet tall. And as he was looking up there, he was sure he saw a man standing at the top of the tower, which was very strange because as far as he knew, the only other guy on the island was in the next room, and he checked and the guy was there. So Dennis went running over to the lighthouse, and as he was going over there, he was still sure he saw somebody up there, and he told me he thought it looked like somebody in an old-fashioned uniform of some kind. So Dennis ran up the stairs of the lighthouse, and of course nobody was there, so again he blamed it on Old George. In more recent years, first of all, as I mentioned, legislation was passed to keep a keeper at Boston Light. And Boston Light is now the only lighthouse in the United States that has an official keeper still employed by the government. Every lighthouse in the United States is automated, and really traditional light keeping is in the past. But legislation was passed, as I said, in 1989 to keep human presence at Boston Light. For the past 10 years, the keeper has been a woman civilian, and that's her on the upper left here. That's Sally Snowman. That is how she pronounces her name. She also wrote a book on the history of Boston Light, and she is our only official lighthouse keeper in the United States. Her job is more about giving tours because the light is automated. But anyway, she's told me a number of interesting stories out there. They also have a program where Coast Guard auxiliary volunteers spend shifts out there. They're called watchstanders, and they'll be out there for a couple of days at a time. So there's pretty much always at least 2 people on the island at any given time. And some of the watchstanders have reported that they have seen what they describe as a ghostly woman. And she's most often seen at the top of the tower at night or at dusk, they say, looking out to sea. And they describe a woman with flowing hair, long flowing hair, and like a white nightgown type of attire. And I'm not saying it's not true, but I will say that's one of the most common kinds of ghosts that you hear all over the place. The woman in white with the flowing hair and all that. So it's kind of a cliche in a way, but that doesn't mean it's not true. But they also say they see her walking the trails at night on the island. And there was one story about one of the watchstanders who was in the keeper's house late at night. They were actually sleeping on a couch, and there was a rainstorm going on, and they were worried that the cellar was going to flood during the rainstorm, so they were near the cellar door and sleeping on a couch. And every once in a while, this person would get up to check the basement for flooding. And one of those times, in the wee hours of the morning, they were going to towards the cellar door, and there were stairs near there coming down from upstairs. And they swore they saw the figure of a woman in white coming down the stairs toward them. And as their eyes met, the figure disappeared. This was described to me in extreme seriousness like this. There's absolutely no doubt that they really, really saw this. I have never spent a night at Boston Light, and I will talk about some paranormal investigations I've been involved in. This is a place that has never had that type of investigation by any of those groups, any of the TV shows or anything else. It's part of the National Park Service, and also still it's managed jointly by the Coast Guard and the National Park Service. So there's a lot of red tape involved if you want to have an investigation there. So I don't know if that's ever going to happen. If it does, I hope I get to be part of it. But anyway, I'm going to jump around geographically a little bit here. And I'm going to go down to the south coast of New England at this point. This is an early drawing of a lighthouse called Penfield Reef Light. If any of you know the geography down there, it's on the border between Bridgeport and Fairfield, Connecticut, Long Island Sound. It's off of Pinfield Beach in Fairfield, and it's just off a very dangerous shoal that was once an island and has been worn down over the years. And there were many shipwrecks on this shallow area in this shoal. So in 1874, they put a lighthouse there so that mariners would know to go around the lighthouse and not go on the inside and hit that dangerous area. People still do it occasionally. And this lighthouse has one of the most famous lighthouse ghost stories in New England. And to me, this is a very compelling one. It's similar to the Boston Light one in a way because it's based on a story we know actually happened rather than on a legend that may or may not have happened. This is an early postcard of the lighthouse right here. And this man is a man named Rudolph Eiton, who was an assistant keeper and later the head keeper. And the story I want to tell you took place in 1916. Eiton at the time was the assistant keeper. The head keeper was a man named Fred Jordan. And it was a few days before Christmas, December 21st, 1916. And Fred Jordan, the head keeper, was going to go to shore to visit his family for Christmas. And he apparently was wood carving was his hobby, so he had created wooden toys he was going to bring to his children. He left the lighthouse about noon on December 21st, and as he was doing that, he could see a storm was coming in, but he thought he could beat the storm to shore. The wind was picking up, the waves were picking up. It's not that far offshore, maybe a mile or something like that. But still, as soon as he left the lighthouse, it really started picking up. And Eiton, the assistant, was watching from the lighthouse as Jordan was struggling to get through those waves and the wind. And he wasn't making any progress, and Eiton saw that he was really struggling, and Jordan was waving for help. So Eiton tried to launch the station's second boat, but he was not able to. I think he barely got it in the water. He wasn't able to make any progress at all because the storm was getting so bad. There was nothing he could do. So he watched helplessly as Jordan disappeared on the waves. Fred Jordan drowned. His body was later found, and when they found him, he had a note in one of his pockets that was written to Eiton, the assistant keeper, and the note was reminding Eiton to finish that day's entry in the logbook. So that's kind of interesting detail there. You'll understand why in a minute. Eiton was interviewed later for a newspaper article, and he said that a few days after Jordan had drowned, he was by himself in the lighthouse on the second floor, and he was in his bedroom. And he said that he suddenly cut something, out of the corner of his eye or whatever. He was sure he saw what he described as a gray phosphorescent figure emerged from the bedroom, like the next bedroom that had been Fred Jordan's bedroom, and he saw this figure go downstairs. So Eiton went out and followed down the stairs where that figure had gone, and nobody was there. He went back upstairs and went at a desk where he would do work, like work on the logbook, whatever. The logbook had been up on a shelf. Eiton was sure he had left it up on the shelf. When he got back upstairs, that logbook was pulled off the shelf, it was on the desk, and was open to the day that Fred Jordan had died. And it was almost as if, he was reminding him to finish the entries in the logbook for that day, because he hadn't entered anything about what had happened with his death and everything. So it's like another reminder. Eiton said that, well, first of all, he became the next head keeper. He was absolved of any blame. Everybody knew he did the best he could, so he was the next head keeper. And he said that over the years, he was there quite a few more years, he and his assistant keepers also saw this strange figure moving around the lighthouse. He was sure it was Fred Jordan. And he actually had the assistant keepers sign an affidavit so people would know he wasn't crazy and he wasn't the only one seeing it. Actually, there's a quote from the newspaper interview where he said, "Something comes here, that we are positive." There's an old saying, "What the reef takes, the reef will give back," which is kind of a creepy way of putting it. But they say that ever since then, there's an old picture of the lighthouse where you can see a foghorn sticking out of the front of it here. They say that many people over the years have seen a ghostly figure there. The people going by in boats say they'll see a figure at the top of the lighthouse, even though it's been automated for many years and nobody's usually normally out there. Or even sort of hovering over the rocks. Did the mic go off?
We have batteries, Jeremy.
I think I might have bumped a little bit. I'm still on. I can speak like this. Can people hear me if I speak like this?
I'll switch out your battery.
All right. Okay. But anyway, you can hear me if I speak up, right? As I said, people have seen strange things there over the years. And one interesting thing about the ghost of Fred Jordan is that he seems to be a very helpful ghost. There are some stories that, for instance, there's a story of two small boys who had taken their boat, were boating in the area, and the seas were rough, and their boat was driven into the rocks by the lighthouse there. And they said that they were kind of thrown up on the rocks, and they were sort of semi-conscious, and that somebody, a man who appeared apparently out of nowhere, pulled them up to safe ground. And as they came to, they got up and they were going to thank the man who had helped them, and they couldn't find anybody. Nobody was there. There we go. Thank you very much. Fresh battery, hopefully that'll last. And another time, there was a yacht, a motor yacht in the area, and they said that as they were in danger of going aground on the reef, they didn't realize that there was that dangerous reef there. They said that suddenly, out of nowhere, a man who looked like an old sea captain appeared in a small rowboat in front of them and was waving them around, to safe water on the outside of the lighthouse. And they followed him to safety, and then suddenly he wasn't there anymore. So, draw your own conclusions. But there's a lot of legends about this helpful ghost of Fred Jordan at Penfield Reef Light. Just one final note on that. Not only is it a story that's based on, the origins or a true event, we know that Fred Jordan drowned there, but to me it's kind of compelling because Eyton and Jordan were friends. I really don't think that Rudolph Eyton would have been joking about this kind of thing or making it up. I think he was very serious about it. I don't think he would be taking it lightly at all. And here's a picture of the lighthouse I took a few years ago. This lighthouse, the government is in the process of giving away lighthouses basically to suitable new owners. In most cases, they're still activated to navigation. The Coast Guard is still taking care of the lights. They're all automated. Offshore ones like this are pretty much all solar powered. You can see the solar panels here. A lot of them now have LED lights. But the government's getting out of the business of taking care of the historic structures because the budget just isn't there. The Coast Guard doesn't have a budget for that. So this lighthouse a few years ago, under the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act, was given to a group called Beacon Preservation. But there was a big dispute over who owned the bottomlands. The state of Connecticut said that they owned it and they wanted to lease it to the group and have them pay rent or something. So the group didn't want to do that. So it ended up reverting to the federal government. And it's going to be auctioned soon. So if you watch for the news or if you watch the GSA website, you may have a chance to bid on a haunted lighthouse. I think the auction's going to start pretty soon, actually. But be careful what you're getting yourself into. That's all I can say if you start bidding on an offshore lighthouse like that. This is another lighthouse down on Long Island Sound in Connecticut. This is one of my favorite lighthouse structures anywhere. I just think this is an amazing building. The architecture, I just love this. This is New London Ledge Light, built in 1909. And if any of you know the geography down there, it's between Groton and New London, Connecticut, the mouth of the Thames River, as they pronounce it down there, T-H-A-M-E-S. It's actually a little bit on the Groton side, so it's part of Groton, Connecticut. And the first time I saw it, the immediate thought I had was this is a mirage. You don't expect to see this beautiful mansion out on a pier out of the mouth of the river. It's just really beautiful. And this has probably the most famous lighthouse ghost story of any New England lighthouse. Here's an old postcard of it. And I'm going to tell you this story, the legend that's usually told about this lighthouse, without any guarantee that this is a true story. Okay, but I'll tell you the usual story. They say that in the 1930s there was a keeper there named Ernie, and nobody seems to know his full name. But they say that Ernie lived in the lighthouse with his wife, and that after living there for a while, his wife became very bored. That part of the story is extremely easy to believe. But they say that Ernie was away from the lighthouse one day, getting some supplies or whatever, and he came back after a while. And when he came back to the lighthouse, there was a note from his wife, and the note said that his wife had run away with the captain of the Block Island ferry. Which is also fairly easy to believe, but the ferry goes by there a few times a day from New London to Block Island, Rhode Island. And poor Ernie, they say, there's different versions of the story, but usually what's said is that Ernie was distraught by this, and that he went to the roof of the lighthouse and dove off to his death. Some versions of the story say that he got drunk and fell off the roof. But often the story is, if you read it in different books, will say that he committed suicide and then he left a note that said that because of what had been done to him, that he would curse the place and haunt it forevermore. And I'm not saying that that's a true story. I don't know for sure. There's no evidence that there was a keeper named Ernie. Nobody's ever produced any evidence that a keeper ever died there. But certainly ever since then, a lot of weird things have happened out there. The Coast Guard crews, and this was one of the last lights in the country to be automated circa, I think it was 1988. And the Coast Guard crews out there talked about all kinds of weird things happening. They said that the light and the foghorn behaved erratically. They'd go on and off by themselves. Their TV would turn on and off by itself. Furniture would mysteriously rearrange itself. Just on and on, all these odd things, strange noises and so forth. One story that I love is that a couple of local fishermen visited the Coast Guard crew there, and the fishermen tied up somewhere outside here next to the pier there, and went in and they had coffee or whatever with the keepers, and they're talking about stuff, and the keepers told them about the ghost stories. And the fishermen laughed and thought that was a big joke, you know, it was ridiculous. When the fishermen went out to leave, their boat had been untied. There was nobody around, but their boat had been untied and was drifting away. So who knows who did that? So anyway, there's just so many stories about this place. One of the stories, by the way, is that only women ever see the ghost of Ernie, and he's only seen in mirrors. At least that's what at least one book claims. I'm not saying that's true either. So it's, you know, a lot of times you read so many things, it's hard to sort out what's true and what's not. But there have been many investigations by paranormal research groups at this lighthouse. And the Ghost Hunters TV show, we were talking about that earlier on the Syfy Channel, was there a few years ago. They actually had nothing happen, nothing at all. One of the few shows where nothing happened. But a show called Most Haunted